Hello, and welcome to the Atlantic Abolition and Slavery module. I'm just going to begin this session by myself and the main themes that we will be discussing over the next 12 weeks. My name is Duncan Frankis. I have just started working at Newman, and as a result of that, I'm not quite up and running on all of the systems yet, which means I don't yet have a Newman specific email address. So, as I am the module coordinator, and you will need to contact me for any concerns or issues you might have regarding this module, in the meantime, contact me on the address that is on this slide at d.j.frankis@beeham.ac.uk. When I get my Newman specific email, I will let you know. But for the moment, contact me via that address. So now let's talk about what we're going to be discussing over the next 12 weeks. There are five major themes that we are going to cover. In the next few weeks, we'll be studying the origins of colonial European empires. We'll be focusing primarily on the French and English empires, but we will also be discussing the importance of the Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch empires, which helped shape the nature of European empires. We would then move into the 18th century, where we discuss the intellectual and philosophical context of the Atlantic world during the early modern period. The Enlightenment movement is one of the most important processes in human history, and the works of individuals such as Kant and Voltaire were crucial in forming and changing people's opinions on slavery and eventually leading to the abolitionist movements in later centuries. We will then discuss the average journey of a slave, not that there is a typical journey as such, but we will look at some slaves who managed to gain their freedom and write up their stories, as well as other individuals who discuss the experience of slaves during their journey throughout the triangular trade route. We will then focus on slave revolts and rebellions, which were surprisingly numerous. The most important case study, which we will focus on for a couple of weeks, is the French colony of Saint Dominique, which eventually would be known as Haiti after it gained its independence. The Haitian Revolution is one of many revolutions in this time period, but it is one of the most important in terms of discussing race and different non European cultures. We will then finish the module by discussing the abolition of slavery, the political and social movements and pressures put on governments to free slaves, and then think about the long term consequences of abolition movements. We will discuss these themes primarily through seminars. We will have a 2-hour seminar every Wednesday afternoon between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. In these seminars, we will discuss the mini lecture that I release each week. I will release it 1 week before the seminar. In the seminar itself, we will discuss that lecture. I will then give you more information and try and make sure you understood the lecture itself, which will lead to debates. It will lead to discussions, and I hope lots of interesting discussions with lots of people who have different perspectives, which I encourage. We will then every week talk about source analysis. I will give you either a chapter of a book from a secondary source for you to read, but I'll also be giving you increasing numbers of primary sources. I think that at this point in your degree, it's really important we focus on critically analysing primary and secondary material, and that's how you're going to get your scores up in your essays. So I'll be introducing lots of primary material. Which brings us on to assessments, which I know you'll all be interested in. And there's a number of important dates which seem far away now, but I think it's important you know when these are in for. So your first assessment will be an essay, which is to be handed in on the 23rd of April. Before that date, I will do essay writing workshops. I'll talk them through with you. I will release 4 or 5 essay questions for you to pick from in the next week or two. So you have plenty of time to think about them. The second assessment is a time task, which is on the 17th of May. Now, I will discuss that in more detail in the coming weeks. We'll do lots of prep for it, so don't worry about that quite yet, but it's important to know when it's taking place. So now we've got the kind of introductions and general admin out of the way. We'll focus on this week's topic, and it's a very introductory week. So, and I think the best way into this topic is to think about the historical literature of slavery and the Atlantic world. So, this week we're thinking primarily about 2 questions: why study slavery, and why the Atlantic world specifically. So, let's focus on that first question: why slavery? Especially in a post-colonial world. In theory, we live in a world where slavery is illegal, and no country has the power to enforce political or trade policy on another nation. However, the terms colonialism and post-colonialism are not that simple. Colonialism doesn't simply refer to the autonomy of a country or one country owning another. It is important to recognize that colonialism is a state of mind. It is an ideology. Colonialism is entrenched and institutionalized in many social structures and systems. And the relationship between the descendants of people from colonized countries and the people from colonizing countries is changing rapidly as people discuss the ways society should move forward and how people from colonized countries should be treated. These kinds of debates are more relevant than ever. In the last 12 to 18 months, some of the news stories that are most focused on, other than COVID, of course, are issues that stem from slavery and abolitionist movements. The Black Lives Matter movement discusses racial inequalities and systemic and endemic racialization in education and policing and judicial systems. When we think about the debates surrounding Brexit. It's all to do with international transatlantic trade and the autonomy and sovereignty of nations and the way that nations trade with each other. And then finally, and really relevant to our course specifically, how the British nation is digesting its historical information, the way in which British people deal with our colonial past and present it through heritage and history events and monuments. The pictures from Bristol have become infamous now, but they start an important debate about how we represent these processes in modern society. And we'll be discussing all of these issues at length throughout the next 12 weeks. So let's focus on the second question of the week. Why the Atlantic world specifically? Some of you may have heard of the Atlantic approach to history, others may not. Since the 1980s, the way we study history has changed dramatically, moving away from local and regional case studies and a much larger geographic scope. I've very clumsily drawn the boundary of the Atlantic world on the right image. And Atlantic history is studying the interaction and the exchange of ideas, people, goods, and services of the nations that line the Atlantic Ocean. So we're talking about North America, Latin America, South America, West African countries, and Europe. And the complex mechanism and exchange of ideas and people between the nations of the Atlantic. On the left hand image, we've got a simplified version of the most common trade route that existed in the Atlantic. And that is known as the triangular trade route. The simplified version of that being firearms, goods, and food being sent from Europe to be exchanged with local leaders in West Africa for huge amounts of their people. And then those people being forced to migrate across the Atlantic Ocean to Central America and Southern American states, where they would be forced to work in plantations to produce rum and sugar, which would be transported back to Europe. Now, that is a simplified version of what we're talking about, but there are lots of different exchanges that we will be discussing in this time period and studying the Atlantic Ocean itself as an interface of the exchange where it takes place. So it's a very specific period of history and a very specific way of approaching history that we will be discussing. To understand these ideas, there are some seminar readings that I think would be really helpful. Now, whilst I'm not on the system yet, I'm told the two readings that you've been given are James L. Lowen's article, What Learning About Slavery Can Teach Us About Ourselves. I would really advise reading that. I'm going to bring it up during the seminar. Walvin's article, which is the second recommending reading, I think if you want to read it, you can, but I won't be delving into it specifically. I won't be asking questions about it, but it's always helpful to read as much as you can. What I'm going to be asking you to read instead of Walvin is going to be the introduction chapter to a very important book called Atlantic History, A Critical Appraisal, which was written by Jack Green and Philip Morgan. So if you can just read the first chapter of that, which is about 20 pages, and it's available on Google Books. I will be talking about this at length, and it's a really good introduction into Atlantic slavery and the historical approach to Atlantic slavery. So if you could read that ahead of the seminar, it would be very important to do that. So to finish today, the four main questions we'll be discussing next Wednesday will be the following. One, what are the strengths and weaknesses to an Atlantic approach to history, which is covered at length in the introduction chapter that I've just mentioned? Secondly, I'll be discussing how did Atlantic slavery differ from previous versions of slavery? So slavery has existed in one form or another for most of human history. Why is Atlantic slavery so different? The third main question that we'll be discussing is what are the links between early modern slavery and modern socio-political events? So I've mentioned a couple of them from the last year, but think about the last 5-6 years. How has slavery influenced modern social, political, and economic debates, structures, and processes? So come up with a couple of ideas that you can talk about. And then finally, and we'll be focusing on this quite a lot, do the British history and heritage industries do a good job at educating the public about issues regarding slavery? And should education regarding Britain's colonial past be changed? You might think that the education system regarding slavery is fine. You may think it needs radical reform. I want to know what you think. And this is going to be a good way for me to gauge how much you know already. So I look forward to meeting you next week and discussing these issues and for the rest of the course. I'll see you then.